Hello, world of YouTube. Dano here, stacking paper, as always. Today we're doing a review of The Man in the High Castle, novel by Philip K. Dick. Very, very famous novel that has since been adapted into a TV show that I have not watched, but just the novel today. I'm assuming it's going to be very different from the show, but we'll do a spoiler-free and spoiler-filled, so I'll just keep it spoiler-free for the first little bit, and then I'll do a spoiler warning when it comes up. So just off the bat, out of 10, I'm giving this a solid 8, like a low 8. I'm glad I kind of waited, because at first I was feeling like a low 7, mostly because the ending kind of threw me for a loop without any spoilers. So I'm just saying it felt like it was missing something. But the more I thought about it, the more it dawned on me that the goal of the book is not really a tight plot, but more of a what if. It's just a plausible scenario. So the premise of this novel is essentially, what if the Axis won World War II and they split America down the middle. Japan takes the western side, the Nazi Germany takes the eastern side, and just what life would be like in that kind of world. And I think it does a really good job of showing how the cultural clashes of both Japan and Germany and how different they are, and how they would mix together either well or not well. Spoiler alert, it's not that well. And it's really just a kind of almost a slice of life. Like, at first, this novel is not at all what I thought it was going to be. I was expecting, like, some big, like, rebellion and, like, you know, underground Splinter Cell type agents trying to break down the power structure and, you know, take back America type shit. That is not at all what this book is. It is really just a day in the life look of multiple characters on both sides of different social classes, and just what it would be like to live in this world. And through that, I think it actually does a very good job. It's very meta. It's kind of a novel in a novel in a novel, which sounds confusing because it kind of is. But the reason the book's called The Man in the High Castle is, I guess we'll go into spoilers now. Yeah, spoilers. So there's multiple POV characters. So we have Bob Chilton, Frank Frink, Juliana Frink, Mr. Tagomi, Mr. Baines, and Mr. Rice. And I'll just kind of go through what each of them are in turn. So Bob Chilton is a collectible shop owner, and he's kind of exploiting the Japanese fetishization of, like, Americana. So he sells, like, antique revolvers and, like, clocks and just shit that Americans made before Japan took over. And unbeknownst to him, most of the stuff he's selling is fake, but he doesn't really realize it until about midway through the novel. And Chilton is kind of a textbook example of Stockholm Syndrome. He loves the Japanese. Like, he's kind of obsessed with them. He even says at one point there is a young Japanese couple that is buying stuff from him, and he gets invited to their house, has a dinner. Dinner doesn't go very well, but he essentially starts, like, groveling, and he's like, I'm so glad you guys won the war, because if America won, we would have descended into this communist state, and it would have went terrible. And they're kind of just sitting there like, okay, dude, it's kind of weird, but you do you. Chilton doesn't have much of a stake in the story. He kind of just is like a middleman between a couple other characters, one of them being Frank Frink. So Frank Frink is an ex-worker for the Wyndham Matson Company, which what they do on the front end is they manufacture, like, parts of buildings, so, like, stairways, railings, doors, and they would just, like, mass produce these for, like, these tenements for mostly Americans, like the second class Americans. But that's just a front end. What they actually do on the back end is they manufacture fake antique goods. So like these same things that Bob Children would be selling, he'd be buying them from wholesalers who would then be buying them from this company. And they're not real antiques, so it kind of it passes through multiple hands, and by the time it gets to the collectible shop owner, he doesn't realize that these aren't real collectibles because he's not like an expert in any of this. He's just making money off of selling it. And so Frank's purpose in the story, so he's a secret Jew. So I'll give you kind of the lay of the land, and I actually had to, I'll be honest, a lot of this wasn't very clear when it comes to like the geopolitical structure of America at this time. I actually had to like look it up. But Japan owns the Pacific side of America. The Nazi Germany owns the northeast and the southeast section, which they've deemed the USA and just the South. And they start like repracticing slavery. It's crazy. And then in the middle, there's the Rocky Mountain states, which are kind of just like this buffer state that Japan allows to exist. It's not really Japanese and it's not German. It's kind of like almost an independent state because the Japanese kind of realize that the Germans are fucking crazy. And I guess, sorry, I'll go into that one once I get to this other viewpoint. But anyways, Frank, he gets fired from his job for mouthing off to one of the higher ups, and decides he's going to start making his own side business where all he does is manufacture jewelry, like fake jewelry, but it looks really good. And he is the one who he goes to Bob Children and kind of exposes that all his stuff is fake. He pretends to be a liaison for the Japanese, and he's like, I'm not going to expose you. I'm just telling you your stuff's fake. But I actually have some real stuff for you if you want to sell it. And that's how he kind of has a bit of a rapport with Bob Children. So yeah, the Japanese actually, they're aware that they're like undercover Jews because technically they have an agreement with the Germans that if they discover Jews living in their side of the country, that they're supposed to extradite them to the Nazi side to just be gassed and killed. But the Japanese kind of realize that this is pretty fucked up, so they are aware that Jews are living in their midst, and they kind of just keep it low key. But yeah, Frank, his whole plot is he makes his own little antique sideshow, and he ends up actually getting arrested, and freed later in the book. But this will lead into this next character. So Mr. Tagomi is a higher up in the Japanese Trade Commission, and his whole arc in the story is just realizing that the Japanese really fucked up by getting in bed with the Germans, because after the war, so the story takes place in 1962, so it's been about like 15 to 17 years after World War II has ended, and the Japanese they're no saints. They've pretty much made all Chinese like second-class citizens, practically slaves. Same with blacks in America. They just did the same thing to them. They don't go as far as exterminating people, but they're not benevolent, you know. That only white people are allowed to have some kind of level of agency and citizenship, but even they have to grovel to the Japanese. But through his interactions with other Germans and other Americans, he kind of realizes that Germany is really messed up and they can't really get out of it now. So yeah, that's his whole goal. And then we have Mr. Baines. There's actually a lot of viewpoint characters. I think there's only like 6 or 7, but they kind of just build up the world. Mr. Baines, he's another secret Jew, but he has infiltrated like the upper ranks of the Nazis, and his goal is to come to America, which, by the way, they fly in on fucking rockets. So it's kind of a logical continuation of the ideology. So the Germans are just as fucked up as they were during World War II, but they now have rocket technology because in real life, near the end of World War II, Germans were developing V2 rockets, which they didn't really get to use much of because it was right at the ass end of the war. But if they were to keep that technology going, they essentially have rocket travel that they use as airplanes, and they've started to colonize the planets, so like Mars and the moon. So they're kind of spreading their filth out into the universe, not just on Earth anymore. So Mr. Baines flies over from Germany to America to... His real mission is to warn the Japanese and Mr. Tagomi, that's who he meets, Tagomi and this general, that the Germans have a secret mission to... Not so secret, but they have a mission to nuke the shit out of the Japanese home islands. And they're kind of staging like a fake battle and blame it on the Japanese, kind of like the USA blaming the Maine on Spain. There's a little history anecdote for you. And that's his goal. And actually in his introduction scene, he's talking to this German on his air rocket, I guess. And it's kind of just showing how like the Nazi ideology has just gotten so out of control, because this German is like, anytime he sees something that he doesn't agree with, he's like, oh yeah, it was probably a Jew that did it, or like that building looks weird, probably a Jew designed it. And Mr. Baines just looks at him and he's like, I'm a Jew and I've infiltrated your upper ranks, and you can't even say shit about me, because if you do, I'll get you arrested and no one will believe you because I'm that high up. And it kind of blows this guy's mind. It was a very, very mic drop intro for him. But who do we have left? So we have Juliana Frank, who's Frank's ex-wife. She lives in the Rocky Mountain states, so the buffer zone in between Japan and Nazi America. And she's shacking up with this Italian, Joe Cinadella, my paisan, but who's actually a secret Nazi. He's not really Joe Cinadella. And their whole arc is they're leaving Denver, and they're going on a little side trip to Cheyenne, Wyoming, to meet the man in the high castle. So the titular character that the book is named after, he's actually... He doesn't really have a lot of impact himself, but it's his book that has an impact. So this is where the novel in a novel comes in. There's a book in this world called The Grasshopper Lies Heavy. And what it is it's an alternative historical fiction of what if the Allies won the war. So what if what actually happened in our real world happened in this fake world. And this book is spread around both the Pacific states and a little bit in Nazi America, but the Nazis have banned it because it's like total blasphemy, and it talks about how the Allies win, but it also kind of goes a little bit farther, and it says like, you know, Winston Churchill starts warring with America and then communism takes over. So it's definitely not exactly what our history is, but the main crux of it is the Axis lose, and obviously the Germans don't want people reading about that. The Japanese don't really give a shit, though. They actually spread it freely, and they allow anyone to read it. And the reason for this is there's it kind of revolves around two books. This is why I say a novel and a novel, because there's another book called the I Ching, which is a real like Chinese philosophical book of kind of vague poetry that's existed for thousands of years. Like in our real world, it's a real book, and I actually just bought it just so I can kind of better understand it. Because multiple characters within this book use the I Ching as an oracle to help, you know, make decisions. They'll be like, they'll ask the oracle a question. They call this book the oracle, and they'll say, you know, is this business decision going to work out? And they manipulate yarrow stalks, which are just like these thin reeds, and by throwing them around in different combinations, they come up with different lines from this I Ching that they then smash together, and it creates some kind of vague philosophical saying that they then have to interpret. And the I Ching was introduced to the Americans by the Japanese when they took over. And so many characters use this I Ching because they see it as a source of truth. And it contrasts with this book, The Grasshopper Lies Heavy, because by the end of the novel, Juliana Frank meets the man in the high castle. He's called the man in the high castle because he wrote this book, and then the Germans wanted to kill him so badly that he shacked himself up in this like mountain fortress, which he doesn't live in by the end of the book. But yeah, so Juliana meets him and essentially asks him, hey, did you use the I Ching to write The Grasshopper Lies Heavy? And the room goes really quiet, and she keeps like pressuring him, and he admits that, yeah, he basically used the I Ching to write this book. And they see the I Ching as a form of truth, so they think that the I Ching itself is what wrote this book. It wasn't really, what was his name? Abinson is his real name. It's almost like Abinson was writing this book vicariously through the I Ching, or the other way around. And they both think, like, why would the I Ching want you to spread this book? Because the reality is Germany and Japan actually lost the war. And that's the way the book ends. And you're like, okay, so what does this really mean? Is this like an alternate universe? Are they living in the darkest timeline? And Philip K. Dick doesn't really answer that question. He kind of just leaves it open-ended. But the way I see it is yes, because there's a couple parts of the book that I missed when I read it. So Mr. Tagomi, the Japanese guy, there's a part of the book where the jewelry that Frank makes is said to contain Wu, which is like some kind of truth. There's some kind of truth to this jewelry, and by holding it, it's kind of like has the same power as the I Ching. And while Mr. Tagomi is holding it, he has like a spiritual experience where he sees an alternate version of San Francisco with like this freeway that doesn't exist, but it exists in our real world. So it makes me that that this is kind of an alternate timeline, and this isn't the way the world is supposed to be. And I think it's these little pieces of truth that park through. So maybe Frank in a world where the Allies won was meant to be a jewelry maker, and because he started doing that little piece of truth brought out the quote-unquote real world. And there's another example. Juliana has like a same kind of thing when she gets to Cheyenne, where she meets Abinson, the man in the high castle. She has that same kind of experience where she feels like she's stumbling into like the real world. But Philip K. Dick is very vague with this. He's really not straightforward, so I actually had to like read into it. So I will say he does lose a little bit of points by not being super straightforward, but I mean, I kind of like that stuff. I personally enjoy novels where I have to think. It's not like given to me. I like a little bit of both. Like Brandon Sanderson's one of my favorite authors, but he is very straightforward. And I like both, but I think I prefer the more vague stuff because it gives you, I don't know, there's a little bit more to chew on, at least for me. And I mean, I didn't touch on like every little detail that happens in this book. Like there's some badass shit. Like Juliana fucking stabs the shit out of the Nazi guy that she's with, because she discovers he's a Nazi and realizes that the only reason he wants to go see the man in the high castle is because he wants to kill him, and she doesn't want that. So she cuts his his carotid artery in his neck with a razor blade and just leaves him in a hotel room. He's like holding his neck, and even he's like, yeah, that was a pretty good shot. I can't really do anything. And she's like, well, good luck. And then he just dies, and she's really cold about it, but I respect it. Bob Chilton, I think he just ends up like going to Japan by the end of the book because he's legitimately obsessed with Japan because of what they've done. Mr. Baines, he ends up going back to Germany, and there's a whole kind of like coup d'etat happening because while he's in America, the leader of Germany, Martin Bormann, he dies, and there's kind of a power vacuum. And then Dr. Joseph Goebbels takes over. There's like a lot of like historical references that I really appreciate in this book. So like Goebbels giving like an impassioned speech over the radio and taking over Germany is very within his realm. He was the Minister of Propaganda, so he's also in an alternative version of him is also in Inglourious Bastards for anyone wondering who that is. But yeah, I don't know. This book was like, the more I think about it, the better it gets, because it really is. There isn't much of a plot. It's just a what if scenario, and it uses the whole core of this book really is the I Ching, which means like when I get my copy, I think I'll have an even greater appreciation for it. And it's super meta because Philip K. Dick himself used the I Ching to write this book. So he used the I Ching to write The Man in the High Castle. And characters within The Man in the High Castle use the I Ching to make decisions about their lives. And the Man in the High Castle in the book uses the I Ching to write The Grasshopper Lies Heavy, the book. So it's super, there's like a lot of layers to this. And on surface layer, I can see a lot of people being frustrated with this book because it doesn't have an extremely satisfactory ending at first. But the more you think about it, the more it's like, oh yeah, they're in the darkest timeline, and it's about the characters in this darkest timeline realizing that they're in the darkest timeline, kind of. So, for me, I really loved it. I'm also a huge Philip K. Dick stan in general. It's only my second novel of his I've read. I read Ubik, which is just completely mind-blowing, and I couldn't recommend that book enough. And a couple short stories, but I have a ton of PKD stuff to read, so there'll definitely be more coming in the future. But for me, 8 out of 10, solid recommend. I'm going to do... What am I doing next? So I just finished Edge Dancer, which is a Stormlight Archive short story that I'm going to record a review for right now. And the next book that I'm reading is Red Country by Joe Abercrombie, part of the First Law series. It's a standalone. So that'll be what's coming up next. But yeah, Philip K. Dick, American legend. Read his book.